I'm being told that for 2 years, more than 2 years, Jolly West was running Manson. If we're to take the dates, he's meant to have met him in Haight-Ashbury in the spring of '67.
Yeah, and I don't personally think that.
But O'Neill is telling us that, and so the idea that Jolly West programmed Manson to do this, I think, is ludicrous.
All right, we are back with Jon Atack, and last time I talked to Jon, we started to talk a bit about Jolly West, who is a historical figure that I have found to be completely fascinating, a very controversial figure. And like many others, I think there's good and there's bad. Nobody is one of anything, and his life may have been affected by choices. However, this caused Jon, who I believe, Jon, how are you doing today, by the way?
I'm absolutely fine, Eric. Lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you. You said you've met Jolly West on at least 2 occasions or more?
I met him 4 times, and each time we spent hours talking. Yeah.
Okay, so that in of itself brings you closer to the subject than I ever could be, because I only have what has come up in research and things like that. But Jolly West is tied to MKUltra. He is tied to the Jimmy Shaver incident in Oklahoma. There's a whole lot there, but at the same time, he also was tied to Patty Hearst, trying to help her. I don't want to say escape punishment, but he helped defend her.
Yeah,
because of mind control and things like that. And he is a very famous enemy of Scientology.
Perhaps in the US, the most famous.
It could be. It could be. He's such a interesting character, though. So this is going to be a deep dive in Jolly West with Jon.
Okay, so what stimulated my interest was that off camera the last time you asked me if I knew that my late friend Jolly West had been involved with programming the Charles Manson family, and my jaw dropped. And in fact, a few years ago, I got the book, Tom O'Neill's book, Chaos, and I looked for Scientology in the index, and it wasn't there. So I didn't read the book, because the connections between Charles Manson and Scientology are overwhelming. So now I did, this time I did. I went and read everything he had to say about Jolly. I read his Intercept article. I watched his fine interview with you. And I pulled out some things. I also went back and reread Charles Manson's purported autobiography, Without Conscience. And to my surprise, O'Neill only makes mention of this in 2 paragraphs to show that Manson had gone to the house, Sharon Tate's house, Roman Polanski's house, where the awful murders had happened, and had left some eyeglasses there. That's the only detail he takes from this 200-page confession by Charles Manson. So I'm a little bit concerned about that.
He did talk, in fairness, in our interview, because I went looking it up, he did mention Scientology. Scientology did come up in our interview. I'm not going to say it was a thorough coverage, but it did come up, and he talked about him. I forgot what it was.
Yeah,
O'Neill Island.
Yeah, he mentions him, and we'll get to that in the course of this, and exactly what he said in the interview with you, which was fascinating. Let's start with a simple point. In Chaos, Tom O'Neill tells us that Jolly West became my white whale. And I'm going to take that as my starting point. Captain Ahab had his leg bitten off by a whale. I know that's very unusual, as whales have baleen plates and can't bite people's legs off. And thereafter, Captain Ahab became completely obsessed. Herman Melville in Moby Dick describes Captain Ahab as a grand, ungodly, godlike man. So I think the comparison ends pretty much between Captain Ahab. I don't think it'd be safe to say that about Tom O'Neill.
I disagree, and I'll tell you why. Jolly West is his next book. He's deep in it right now. And I did confirm it with him. He's hoping he can even get it done in 2 years. But this is the guy who took 20 years to write Chaos. Now, I'm not going to speak to his motives, but I will say that perhaps he didn't go as deep in everything as he could because he's saving a little bit for the next book. But Jolly West is his next book. So he could well be the obsessed with the subject, and he's just not spreading it yet. He was covering that. He admitted doing that in Chaos. He admitted in the interview that, he's hid this, hid that. It was very secretive with his sources, his material. He was even a little cagey when I asked things like, well, how did you get that thing? And he's like, well, another journalist gave it to me. And it's kind of like, well, you could have it digitized, dude. What? But I can just tell you, he's very, very, very protective of things. So I just wanted to push back a little bit on that.
Yeah, well, so I'm saying what I said there is that I don't think he is Captain Ahab, and what you're saying is, yes, he is.
He may well be.
Jolly West is his great white whale. And
yes, he may well be.
I'm quite keen on whales. I think they're innocent creatures. And and as to the evidence that he's gathered, and I went around, and the Times Literary Supplement called his book a masterpiece. Yeah. And I found a lot of people who are saying, oh, well, this proves Jolly West did that. There is no shred of proof in O'Neill's Chaos. He himself says, I didn't have a smoking gun. I worried I never would. I could poke 1,000 holes in the story of the killings, but I couldn't say what really happened. In fact, the major arms of my research were often in contradiction with one another. To imagine state, local, and federal law enforcement cooperating in perfect harmony, with the courts backing them up, it made no sense. What I'd uncovered was something closer to an improvised, shambolic effort to contain the sequence of events without tripping on something. Now, what he's asserting is that Jolly West possibly met Charles Manson in Haight-Ashbury when Jolly West was running a crash pad for acid heads where they could be observed.
Right, the tie is tighter to Smith than it is to West, and Smith kind of worked under West a little bit. So, well, is that where you're going with that?
Yeah, you see, Smith worked under West. That's an interesting. I'm not sure they
or with.
Yeah.
Okay.
My theory that Manson and West were linked. Sorry, I'll start that again. My theory that Manson and West were linked was tenuous, circumstantial, lying solely in the fact that they'd walked the same corridors of the same clinic. Wouldn't it be more effective to argue that the entire prosecution of Manson was a sham, with Helter Skelter as a cover-up? Maybe Jolly West didn't even belong in the book. And finally, on the subject, so he's basically saying, have no direct evidence. He says, the most far-out theory, he goes on to say that he follows the most far-out theory, which is that Manson was tied to an MKUltra effort to create assassins who would kill on command. Okay. When he gets to the Jimmy Shaver story, which he talks about also in the Intercept article, what he asserts is that in 1954, he believes that Jolly West programmed a situation where a 3-year-old girl was murdered, and Jimmy Shaver was found guilty for that. It's not. The idea is that.
I think that's pushing it a little. I think he's saying that the result, not that he programmed him to commit atrocities, and I want to be careful with my wording, but that it could be the result. And that's something that I want to explore also with Dr. Shaham Das about the effects of LSD, massive amounts of LSD on the psyche, especially if somebody may be already diagnosable with a low-level mental illness or something like that. I don't know anything about that, so I'm going to talk to a doctor about it. But I think it would be the same question of if Jimmy Shavers was perhaps in a program, fed a ton of LSD, something could have snapped. Not necessarily that he was programmed to do that, but he could have been exposed to something that may have had an effect on his psyche.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to be as fair as I can on that.
We must be absolutely strictly fair, which is why I'm using O'Neill's own words to describe this. The idea is that in 1954 it was possible to coerce somebody, influence somebody into committing a murder, which he did not remember, then what was the point of the MKUltra program? Because that was what it was meant to be doing. Why did they spend 20 more years trying to find out how to do that if Jolly West had already done it? That,
Right. Well, but this is early level, and I don't know if he, programmed or something went awry. All I'm saying is I don't want to just definitively say that. Like, I think that Sirhan very well may have been programmed.
Yes, and of course,
there's a lot of evidence backing me up on that, and that was also almost 20 years later.
Yeah,
but like that could have been the success of the program for all we know.
Yeah, it possibly. Alan Shefflin is a good friend of mine, and he's been working on the Sirhan case for decades with exactly that idea. It's also fair to say that I don't think Alan would mind me saying that Alan disliked Jolly West intensely.
Well, there we go. No. Well, and I'm not direct because there's also another guy, William Joseph Bryan, who Mark and I, have done the research, especially Mark, feel is tied closer to Sirhan. And they were kind of running parallel. I mean, I think they were born a year apart. William Joseph Bryan is the great-grandson or grandson of William Jennings Bryan, a very famous American orator, presidential candidate through multiple elections. He used to debate against Lincoln. This guy, he wrote the book called The Chosen Ones, which is all about how to pick juries, and also, so he was writing about body language and jury interaction and all that way back when. That book is like in the 30s or like in the 40s or somewhere in there. So it's really some squiggly lines because yes, we have, I think it's David Smith, Professor David Smith, I think definitively was working the clinic where the Manson people went. I haven't hammered the Manson angle as much personally because I think the Jimmy Shavers is more interesting. And I think the correspondence with Sidney Gottlieb is more interesting. And the MKUltra and the Air Force, I feel like some of that, it kind of rings that even if he was not directly doing it, he very well could have been studying just simply, hey, here, take some acid. Because there was a Operation Midnight Climax, for example, where they would slip acid and they would just watch and see how they acted. So that involved no programming whatsoever. That was just a matter of, hey, let's see what happens here. So is it possible that in the 50s, I'm going to reach right back to it because I'm trying to give him a break, that no, he wasn't programming. It was more an observational thing. Same way as Ted Kaczynski. I don't know if he was programmed, but he got a lot of acid in MKUltra. Or Whitey Bulger, I don't know if you knew this, but he was subject to MKUltra and was getting up to like 70 doses of LSD in his time in prison early on. So all this was going on. And that was, I believe, in the 50s as well, or 60s. This time period is very elastic in my brain, but they were being experimented on. So who's to say that Jimmy Shaver wasn't just yet another LSD experiment running out of Oklahoma with the correspondence between Sidney Gottlieb and Jolly West?
We don't appear to have any evidence at all that Shaver took LSD. The fact that thousands of other people were given it. What's more, of course, Jolly West was a defense witness for Shaver. He didn't, and pleaded temporary insanity for him, supported that case. And as O'Neill says, thereafter, he was vehemently against the death penalty. And the word psychopath is used to describe Jolly West in this book. There are no psychopaths who are vehemently against the death penalty. What's more, we know that Jolly was active with Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement. We know that he took offense to Scientology. I think he first wrote about Hubbard in 1952. These kind of risks are not risks that psychopaths take. They don't do things for the public good. We know that Jolly West was, he fought off court cases from Scientology. He was publicly outspoken. the American Psychiatric Association, he said, "I'm not intimidated. It's a cult, and Hubbard is a quack." So he was
right. Now, on that, by the way, if Tom O'Neill called him a psychopath, that doesn't mean that I've called him a psychopath. I've never
Eric,
thought that he.
This is a conversation. This is a conversation about O'Neill's book. I'm not responding to anything you said. This is, but I like you, so don't worry about it.
No, I'm just saying. I like I said early on. I think Jolly West was a complicated man, and I think he very well could have seen what happened to Jimmy Schaefer's and felt like this is a horrendous justice. It would change his whole life. Not necessarily psychopath. I mean, these people, like Sidney Gottlieb, who I was bringing up, crazy dude. Okay, poisoner in chief. Came up with every possible way to, we'll put poison on a diving suit for Castro. I mean, just this guy was nuts. Brought in everybody in Operation Paperclip because he couldn't have too many Yahtzees working for the government. All this was going on with Gottlieb. But Gottlieb also was a huge believer in communes, nature. He lived like it's like he lived and the people around him were treated almost in the exact opposite manner. And it's hard to explain, but I've been in the military. And there is a sense of your duty to the country where what your personal feelings are irrelevant in some of these situations. And a person can do monstrous acts and not be a psychopath. Now, I'm not saying that Jolly West definitively did monstrous acts, but I'm saying that he was involved with some program. I feel the MKUltra, I think there's enough out there. And I think the MKUltra could be seen as many as monstrous for whatever the intention. What they did to students, to people who were in asylums, state hospitals, these were not, even Whitey Bulger, Ted Kaczynski could be a result of MKUltra. We don't know. Take somebody who's already a little unstable and ram it through. Again, that's why I wanted to talk. So I can totally see that Jolly West could well have been anti. And by the way, if he's already looking into mind control and working with people with mind control, that's one dude who could say, "Oh, that's a cult. That's mind control. I know it." I mean,
and he then stood up against it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't disagree with you at all. MKUltra was evil. It's the very definition of evil, spraying cadmium into crowds to see what the heavy metal would do to people, giving the drug BZ. LSD is whatever. It's coming back into use now. Psilocybin is being legalized. Hallucinogens, drugs of that class, are, not as dangerous as we were led to believe. Delirians, and this is a point where, I have to absolutely go, why is O'Neill not talking about Toloache tea? Because both Charles Manson and Tex Watson said, and they misspell it, they call it Talachi. They were using it. By very curious coincidence, I think it was the second time I met Jolly West, I was with Steve Hassan. And because Jolly was a leading expert on drugs, Steve said, "What drug do you think the Manson family were taking?" And he immediately said Jimsonweed. Now, this is Datura. This is a well-known drug. The thuggies in India used to murder people having given them doses of Datura. It's separated out from hallucinogens because rather than distortion of reality, which is what you get with LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, with the deliriants like Datura, you are in a nightmare. Now, Tex Watson says he took it before the Tate murders. It's right there. He says it. Charles Manson confirms that.
I thought they were on benzos or what is that, speed?
They may well have taken speed. He'd also taken
because
LSD.
Almost like meth heads, because they acted in a manner that a modern somebody really deep into meth might have acted too.
That's possible, though. I do take what's his name, Carl Davis at Columbia's point of view that maybe we have exaggerated the effects of many drugs, including amphetamines and PCP. that the clinical literature does not support the popular belief. And of course, we all know lots of people who have ADHD and take Adderall on a daily basis.
Absolutely.
Former President
But we
Trump.
have different tolerances too. Like
we do.
You could take an alcoholic who's drinking. Well, I've interviewed John McAfee, and John McAfee told me, literally, he was very open about it. He'd drink at least one full bottle and not a fifth of like a Jack Daniels or Wild Turkey or one of those a day, which would probably kill you or me. We would get alcohol poisoning.
Sure.
So it all depends too, because what they're taking, what their status is, their how much of a tolerance they built up. There's a lot of factors. Sorry.
Absolutely, but when we come to the effects of LSD, the effects of various other drugs, then they were taking a drug which puts you on a 3-day trip where you are no longer in reality. Not like LSD and, not seeing patterns in the rug or something. You're seeing things that absolutely aren't there. The ayahuasca, ibogaine are 2 other delirians. I remember talking to a guy, he was trying to persuade me I ought to take ayahuasca. He said, angels come and talk to you. And it's like, I don't think I want to talk with angels. Thank you very much. So where LSD induces, let's say a minorly delusive state, we're dealing with a totally different class of drugs here. So O'Neill says Manson had used LSD to collect and reprogram his followers. But he also says what Jolly West says about LSD. LSD made people more difficult to hypnotize. And he says what Dr. Eugene Schofield says, LSD produced disorganized behavior, not violent behavior. So
and that's something that cults hate, because you've got to keep people in line.
Yeah,
correct?
So in Scientology, LSD is singled out as a drug that you shouldn't use because you can change your mind when you've taken it and when you're trying to program people. So the whole MKUltra, they did thousands of trials with LSD, and what they found was it was a very good agent for confusing people. But I have no evidence that it could be used to program or brainwash people. Obviously, after 40 years of studying programming and brainwashing people and talking with literally thousands of people, this seems to me, it's not being explained to me what the program was. I'm being told that for 2 years, more than 2 years, Jolly West was running Manson. If we are to take the dates, he's meant to have met him in Haight-Ashbury in the spring of 67.
Yeah, and I don't personally think that.
But O'Neill is telling us that, and so the idea that Jolly West programmed Manson to do this, I think, is ludicrous.
And I could see you saying that, because again, I was thinking that the direct contact with Manson, if you said David Smith, I would say more likely. But I totally agree with you that the tie from Jolly West to Manson is really David Smith, because they were peers in a sense. So yeah, I could see that. It looks odd. Now Jolly West and Sidney Gottlieb, I'll push back at you all day and say, yeah, no, I think they talked. There's letters, there's correspondence.
Yeah, there are no letters between Sidney Gottlieb and Jolly West. There are letters between Stanley Grifford and Jolly West.
Right,
yes, but there are 149 sub-projects in MKUltra. How many of them can we trace? How many of the people who received funding?
And why can't we trace them, John? Tell me why we can't trace them.
Because Richard Helms destroyed all the files.
Yeah, specifically Sidney Gottlieb for Richard Helms. Except, fortunately, we have bean counters in the world, and those damned accountants kept records. But other than that,
people who were doing these experiments were not told, this is the CIA, this is what we're doing. They were funded, through the Project for Human Ecology, or in the case of Jolly West, Chemofrill. He received letters between 1953 and 1957 from somebody calling himself, I think it's Sherman Grifford, in fact, not Stanley, Sherman Grifford, from Chemofrill. He didn't receive letters from the CIA, from Sidney Gottlieb.
Right. So you're saying he could be a dupe, and not in a bad way, but literally he thinks he's doing work for this organization that may have a grant or whatever. And he never corresponded with Sidney Gottlieb. He corresponded with Sherman, what's his nose.
Yes. And So O'Neill's assertion that Jolly West designed the blueprint and for 20 years was involved with MKUltra is completely unsubstantiated. What we have, and I went to a book, I have it here, I don't know if you know it, Science of Coercion, Professor Christopher Simpson.
Heard of it, but I've not read that yet.
He analyzes communication research and psychological warfare from 1945 to 1960. And in this book, he says 96% of social psychology, communications research in the decade after the Second War was funded by the US military. So we have a situation where, in fact, thousands of experiments are being funded by these front groups. And the idea that Stanley Milgram or Phil Zimbardo or Solomon Asch or Muzaffar Sharif would have known the source of their funding, it seems unlikely, as this was a top secret project. So they were going out.
Right. By the way, it could be possible. That's why he had such a visceral action to Jimmy Shavers too. That he could have at that point been like, "Oh my God, something horrible happened." He can't talk about it because whatever confidentiality, what have you. But, he's fighting for him. No, it's temporary insane. And, that could have changed the course of his life. I'm saying it again. And it could have been an innocent thing.
And we have no information that he'd ever met Shaver before, his interview with him. So the amount of speculation necessary to hang the great white whale, or you probably don't hang great white whales, they're a bit too big for that, but to harpoon the great white whale, there we go, it just isn't there. And returning to your interview with Tom O'Neill, and don't get me wrong, the guy's a brilliant researcher, okay? I'm just not so keen on his speculation. But what he said to you was the official narrative is that he, Manson, audited or was audited for about 100 hours and absorbed a lot of the techniques, a lot of the language of this religion, and he does air quotes when he says that, and then walked away from it. But a lot of it stayed, stuff about ego and all this wordplay. The question is, was there more to that? Scientology had been infiltrated by federal agents too, who were using it to accomplish things. Now, I've been studying Scientology for 50 years. That's only the second time I've ever heard anybody assert that federal agents had infiltrated Scientology and were using it to accomplish things. We know about a CIA.
Yeah, I heard the reverse, actually. I've heard that the Scientology infiltrated the IRS and the government themselves, but I haven't heard a lot outside of that. So
exactly. They infiltrated the Coast Guard, the Justice Department, the IRS, the Home Office here, the French government, the Canadian. They put agents everywhere. The only person I've heard say that in fact, the FBI had taken Scientology over was second Deputy Commodore of the Scientology Sea Organization, Captain Bill Robertson. And Bill told me in 1983 that the FBI had taken Scientology over and that meanwhile the alien Markabians had landed in Switzerland, 200,000 of them, and taken over transcendental meditation and the Freemasons, and that the world would be taken over by these people in 1986. Now, there may have been a parallel fork in reality where that happened, but in the world we live in, it didn't. And Captain Bill was a nutcase, beginning to end. So he says that, and then he says, and there's an interesting character who was the one who taught Manson Scientology, which is Lania Raymer, who doesn't name, who later represented Squeaky Fromm. I don't think that's true. Raymer was not a lawyer after the assassination attempt of Gerald Ford in 1975. So this is when a member of the Manson family tried to kill Gerald Ford.
Yeah, I know Squeaky. 76, I think.
Lynette Fromm. He said 75 in your interview. I'm sure you're right. And then he does.
Okay, that's probably right.
Then he does mention Lania Raymer, and then he says Bruce Davis. And he says Bruce Davis, who was there at two of the killings, was suspected in a couple of other murders, including 2 Scientology teenagers in LA in November of 1969. Now, this is an important point that, as I say, you've got Sandra Good and you've got Leslie Van Houten, who's just up for parole, and you've got Bruce Davis, who are also listed.
She won parole.
Oh, she got it.
Leslie.
Yeah.
I think she got it, and I think Gavin Newsom revoked it, and I think he might have been overruled. But yeah,
That was what we were waiting for. I
her-
haven't heard on that yet.
yeah, Sirhan also was given parole because my show partner was testified for Sirhan. By the way, it was right around the same time. Now, Gavin Newsom spiked Sirhan. He's still in. I think he's come up again and probably been denied. So he's probably never getting out.
But we have a situation where we have 4 members of the family who had done Scientology courses. We then come to the documents, which I'm presuming O'Neill hasn't seen. These were seized by the FBI in 1977. And I'm not sure that they understood what they'd got. It was the largest raid in the FBI's history up until that time. And they took a room full of documents, floor to ceiling. They got so many documents, many of which have been stolen from the US government, of course. So we have this situation where in 1979, Mary Sue Hubbard, the wife of the founder of Scientology, Ron Hubbard, is sent to prison for 5 years. She's charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, bugging, burglary, falsification of government credentials, theft of documents, and on a massive scale. She signed a 217-page stipulation of evidence confessing to these things. There is no doubt. So we wind back a little bit and we go back to an internal document called Ray, Our Disinformation Action on the Process, Ray Manson. This document was sent to Mary Sue.
Hold on. Are you talking about the Process, who was considered like another religious cultish organization?
The Process, the Process, yes. Two nations divided by a common language. The Process.
Process. But yeah, is that the same thing we're speaking of?
Yes, it's a splinter group from Scientology, started by 2 people who restyled themselves the De Grimstons. Of course, David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, is also implicated with Process membership.
Right. Well, that's why it popped up, is because of Maury Terry's book that tried to tie him, which, by the way, he tried to tie him all the way to Manson too. So that one is, kind of suspect.
Scientology's internal documents are also saying that they're worried about this connection that's being suggested to the Process, and that might get them into trouble. It's interesting. This report was actually made to Mary Sue Hubbard a month before the Manson trial began. So it was on the 22nd of June, 1970. Scientology already has this on the radar, and they're already doing a cleanup job. In that document, it says that Manson had approximately 150 hours of Scientology auditing or processing. To put that in context, in my 9 years, I didn't receive that much. If you were taking 1-hour sessions of counseling, this was over a 14-month period in McNeil Island in prison back in 1962-63. So for 14 months, he's getting this stuff. That's about 2 or 3 hours every week of these processes. Now, Scientology, without any doubt, and you can talk to anybody in my field, is the most elaborate set of social behavioral controls, behavior modification controls ever devised. That has to be relevant if 4 members of the family had been trained in this system. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Also,
if he was getting it in prison, he would have fewer distractions from his training of external life, because obviously prison is much more limited in his exposure to any alternative narrative, if you will.
What Manson says in Without Conscience is that he got heavily into Dianetics and Scientology. And at this point, he's 27 years old. He's just learned to read and write. He's been pretending all these years, and now he's learned to read and write. And he says he read everything he could. So we not only have 150 hours of Scientology auditing, we also have that he did training routines, the communication processes, that famous 1,000-mile stare that Manson and his followers have. It's standard to all Scientologists. It's entrained. You're taught to sit for some hours looking without moving your eyes at all at another person. Manson did this, and you do it every time you do it for some hours. that would be outside of his 150 hours of auditing. So he's reading Scientology books. He's putting all of this material into his head. The thing that has to be said about Scientology, and Hubbard himself said it, this is not me being unpleasant. Scientology is a system of control. It's a way of developing what Hubbard called infinite control. He called it 8C. He used to put the infinity symbol vertically for some unknown reason. So infinite control. This is the point where a Scientologist is meant to be able to intend another person to do something. And as I said, Manson got heavily into this. And he makes a statement in his book about the effect of this on him. Through this and my other studies, I came out of my state of depression. I was understanding myself better, had a positive outlook on life, and knew how to direct my energies to each day and each task. And most importantly, I had more confidence in myself and went the way I chose to go, whereas previously I'd always been content to listen and follow. So this is a transformative event for Manson. And we then get 3 other members of the family who will also have done training routine 0, because that's the start of Scientology. That's the first thing you do. So we have these people. We then add to that the events that, where he stabs a guy, he shoots a guy and thinks he's killed him, Crow. He thinks he's killed a Black Panther. Paranoia descends upon them. Members start taking Datura and freaking out. And you then get Bobby Beausoleil's, the first killing, Gary Hinman, which is initiated by Manson. I think he cuts him.
There's another step in there too that I think you might be missing. Supposedly he was trained by William Dean who, and I sent you this in the chat if you want to dig into it, who was born as Bernie William Smith, a Sunset Boulevard club manager in hypnosis. So I'm not going to turn away the Scientology, but I'm just saying this is a guy who was getting involved with Scientology or whatever, obviously kind of into the whole mind control aspect or controlling others aspect of it. And then he got further training, it appears, by this guy, William Dean, who, by the way, was convicted apparently for using hypnosis to do things to women.
We're not going to ask what things. Make their hair look nice, or
yeah, well, yes. I mean, self-confidence. He helped him with self-confidence and quitting smoking. Absolutely.
Okay. So this guy, William Dean, you're saying trained Charles Manson
as well. We've got the Scientology ties. It appears there's enough records with that, but I'm saying here's another one. So Scientology, and you will straighten me out on this. I do, from what I understand, feel like there's a hypnotic component of it, but I'm wondering if it's on the NLP side of things or if it's full-blown hypnosis, whether, how it's going about.
Well, yeah, let's step aside. And there's a hell of a discussion about hypnosis, NLP. Obviously, that they've been essential to my understanding of things. What we're talking about is the simple distinction that's made between deep trance hypnosis, where you are allegedly completely out of control and somebody, you'll dance like a chicken and do all of that stuff.
Sure.
Still, the Hell's Angels dance like chickens too, but that's another matter altogether. And you've got NLP, which is theoretically a light hypnosis. Now, I'm going to push all of that away. That hypnosis is guided imagination. That's the definition from the Oxford University Handbook on Hypnosis. It's just guided imagination. In terms of Scientology, what you would be taught by a hypnotist or a hypnotherapist is pretty narrow in its meaning. Scientology, as L. Ron Hubbard said, is, well, he said, we have ways of making slaves here. Back in 1952. He also said we can brainwash faster than the Russians back in the 50s. So you have somebody who has created a whole system. He
also lied a lot too, in fairness, and exaggerated his abilities and some things.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's get to that. 1973, Mike Rinder, aged 18, arrives on Hubbard's ship to train as an executive. He's told when he gets there that his passport has been taken, that the Australian organisation has exchanged him for some courses, and he now belongs to the Sea organisation. So they did make slaves. This isn't just Hubbard making an assertion about that. Hubbard made slaves. He had a situation where he made $648 million. That's how much he had when he died. And he was denying the use of toilet tissue to his followers. So
I agree. I was just trying to, play devil's advocate, if you will, in some ways on that. But yes, I do agree, especially the Sea Org smells like slavery. It's like quacks like a duck, whatever, but they're signing your life away for pennies. So I'll be courteous, and it smells like indentured servitude with no expiration. But anyway.
And there are so many examples of it. Leah Remini at 13 being sent to be a cleaner instead of continuing her education. Catherine Spallino, who I think you've now had on, talking about her childhood in Scientology. Hubbard did have ways of making slaves. I agree with you absolutely. I don't think anybody's done more to expose the lies of Ron Hubbard than I have over the years. He was a notorious liar who said honesty is sanity and then lived down to it. But I think that he was offering an honest opinion about slavery, and I think and about brainwashing. With Scientology, he created a context in which it would continue. And part of
reinforcing
that...
Yeah.
Yes, reinforcement. Part of that is indeed the training routine zero stare, that you induce a state called the Ganzfeld effect into yourself. So you were as if drugged all the time. You were in a slightly more suggestible state. So I think that if you combine Manson's criminal mentality, when they started stealing cars again, his paranoia that the Black Panthers were going to come and get him, then you get Gary Hinman, where they're wanting money out of Hinman, and Hinman ends up dead. From there, the idea is that because they needed to get Bobby Beausoleil out of jail, they needed to commit other killings that would have the same profile as the Hinman killing, and victim's blood was used to write on the wall, this sort of thing. And off they go and do it. Now, Manson basically says, yeah, I'm guilty. I should be in prison, but not for murdering anybody, and not. He took part in the conspiracy to do it, no doubt. It's also interesting to say, the other thing that I've looked to is the incredible video, Manson, the Lost Tapes, which came out after Tom O'Neill's book. But you have videos of, I think, 5 members, including Sandra Good, who'd done Scientology, 5 members of the Manson family a week after the arrests, which I think are November 1969. Somebody goes down to Spahn's movie ranch and interviews these girls, they're teenagers. Those tapes are then locked away for years. Somebody comes back, finds the tapes, and goes and interviews those women now. And there, I think you get the truth of Manson is portrayed as some kind of love and peace hippie that went wrong, but there is nothing in what these girls are doing that says that. They all have the stare. They all have the training routine zero stare. They're in a state of incredible, intense paranoia. Later on, one of them talks about being 14 and being raped by Charles Manson. So I have no defense for Charles Manson here, but I have a lot for Jolly West, that he's being accused of something. And I don't see, having looked at brainwashing programs now for 40 years, written about them extensively, looked at the Chinese programs, the Russian programs before them, MKUltra, MK Naomi.
Have you worked with Lifton at all?
I haven't worked with Lifton, but I'm extraordinarily familiar with his, 8 sins of thought reform. And I've read a lot of his work. I have contact with him, but it's not my good fortune to be among that wonderful.
How about Margaret Singer?
Yeah, Margaret was a supporter of mine. She actually put money into saving my book, Blue Sky, from bankruptcy, so Scientology wouldn't get it. So, yes, I've been around the people who do this, but I've looked into it. If you are going to assert that somebody has been brainwashed, just as Lifton did, you have to look at the steps. You have to say this is what happened. Saying they were programmed using LSD, no, that's not enough. And I don't see anything about the use of isolation, for example, which would be standard. It's used at Guantanamo Bay, of course. I don't see anything about dependency and dread, which would be aspects of the West model. And I'm led to somebody who actually spent a life helping people. The only MKUltra experiment, if indeed it was MKUltra, that it can be linked to is where he was observing the effects of LSD. He wasn't programming anybody to do anything. He was seeing what LSD does. Unfortunately, of course, along the way, he gave LSD to Tusko the elephant,
which, by the way,
over and died.
In fairness, Mark and I don't think Tusko died of an LSD overdose. We think he died of them trying to save him.
I agree. Yeah, I looked at that along the way, and so, but you know. Jolly did say it was terrifying because Tusko's partner was pushing at the wire trying to kill him, you know. But so, I don't see this connection. I think, to say that he received some letters from somebody posing as somebody that offered him funding, or when we go back to the Jimmy Shaver incident, that a major in the Air Force, which Jolly was at that time, as a psychiatrist, being called in to look at this man seems perfectly normal to me. He was a serviceman. And
what about one more? What about Jack Ruby?
Well, Jack Ruby, we have in his interview with you, O'Neill said that Jolly West snapped Ruby into insanity in a single session. I've 40 years of studying this. I've never seen a case of that where you could go into a room with somebody and do something to them and thereafter they'd be mad. Also, the accounts of Ruby show that he was relatively delusional leading up to that point.
I think he had syphilis, possibly.
Yeah, and that can be a bit worse than spending half an hour with Jolly West, I would think, in terms of its psychiatric effect. So yeah, he'd go into stage 3 syphilis and be completely crazy. So to accuse Jolly of doing this, we're just adding things to a list here, which they're great white whale. He doesn't have evidence to support this. One of the popular notions about cults is that they create compliant robots, zombies, and it's not true. In the short term, if looking at, say, the work of Ariel Mareri in Tel Aviv, interviewing suicide bombers who failed and their families, and it's the most extensive work of its type, or Anna Spekova's work with Kaptur Akhmedova on the Black Widows in Chechnya, you can take somebody in a few days, put them out there, and they'll kill themselves. But looking at the Palestinian-Israeli situation, those people will usually be dead within 3 days of being recruited. They are not people. What's more, they're recruited in a context where, of course, the Israelis are seen as oppressors. But, young Palestinians of 2 or 3 years old will be photographed with suicide belts on it. It's part of a culture. We don't see that in the family. We see something which, as O'Neill says, is shambolic.
Very disorganized situation.
Yeah. And I mean, in finishing, the article I've written for probably for Tony Ortega's bunker, who knows, he might not take it. In O'Neill's account, West has become a magician with supernatural abilities beyond description or explanation. We don't find out how he did any of this. We also, and I take offense at this, he says he only met Jolly once and Jolly droned on at him so much that he ended the conversation. Now, this I've never met anybody as fascinating or more fascinating than Jolly West. He was an incredible conversationalist. He was a polymath. He knew so many subjects.
Yeah, I would say in his speeches, he seemed to be a cheeky guy.
Even the British Broadcasting Corporation has stated that psychiatry and the KGB operate in direct collusion. End quote. I guess that puts me in a peculiar position, since most of the Scientology literature about me, it's said that I'm an agent of the CIA. If I'm also working for the KGB, I guess that would make me a double agent, wouldn't it? Pretty exciting.
It seemed pretty witty. I don't. The speeches I've seen aren't really droning. They're more of a well, a little bit self-effacing, kind of humorous, but I would agree just on the speeches that I've seen that he comes off as a pretty engaging speaker, at least on stage. But
and off stage too. I mean, I would definitely say that he is among, and I've had a very fortunate life. As I say, I did know Margaret Singer. I've known a number of people who are geniuses, who are absolutely brilliant, and Jolly is right up there. I've never met anybody who knew more or was more interested, and seeing him portrayed as this kind of venomous, evil man when he was so determined to share what he'd found. The situation by the early 1970s, there were 90 US universities giving degrees in psychology. Only 6 of them even mentioned hypnosis. And yet Jolly, right from the 50s, kept saying, no, this is relevant. This is a way of controlling people. We need people to understand this. So, as I have, he spent decades exposing the techniques of mind control. So it's like the allegation saying that a doctor has studied so that he can deliberately kill people. Now, we do know we've got Harold Shipman, so it has happened. But I would say that for the most part, doctors study to cure people, and the reason that they do what they do is to help people. And I have very much the same impression of Jolly. And hopefully our talking about it will lead, pull some people out of the woodwork who also knew him. I did have a long conversation with Joe Zimhart because of this was coming up. Joe knew Jolly very well. He worked with him. And he said, no, he was a lovely man. He was a deeply compassionate man who went out of his way without being paid to help people. Certainly when I was asked to submit my book, Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, as a PhD thesis to Aarhus University in Denmark, he was the first person to write me a letter of recommendation, which I found quite embarrassing. He seemed to have such a high opinion of me, and unwarranted, I'm sad to say. But he was straight there to help. He wanted good to be done in the world. So, I agree with you. There are people who've done harm and are good people. I'm not sure Sidney Gottlieb was one of them, but he did follow Nature Boy in certain ways of his behavior. But Jolly, there was no whiff of sulfur. This is a man who seemed charming. Allegations about his relationship with his wife. I only met Catherine once, the last time we met. And these were 2 people who in their 70s were still in love, something that you don't necessarily see that often. They seem to have a very convivial relationship. So I have met people who were evil also. And they give off a very different feeling. Jolly didn't seem selfish.
Well, this is perfect then. I'm going to leave it to all of you. What do you think? Do you think that Jolly West is a monster and his legacy needs to be reevaluated? Or do you think Jolly West is somebody who might have been caught up in some things that he didn't necessarily mean to be, but was a good man at heart? Or do you think he's completely innocent? Please comment below, and hopefully we can continue having this conversation and others, because I love going back and forth with Jon on this.
It's been great fun, Eric. Yes, thank you so much. And hopefully Tom O'Neill will comment, and I hope not to upset him, because I do tremendously respect the research he's done and how meticulous he's been. I just disagree with his conclusions and wish he'd find another whale to pursue.